speaking to a guy named Ben, I realized something the other day. And that is that as YouTubers, we seem to make everything look so easy. Years worth of work is condensed down into a couple of minutes in a video. And what may seem like hours or days to us, seems like minutes to you on the YouTube. And in this video, I'm going to show you what 2 weeks of work looks like in about 20 minutes. This is Groundeffected. My name is your dad. And today I'm going to be painting Raistlin Majere from Dragonlance. This golden wizard-like man is some kind of a character from a Dungeons and Dragons story that I know nothing about. But I'm going to condense that down into a very short video for you to see how I made it. And now if you would like to support the channel, the best thing you should probably do before you carry on any further is to click the like button and go down into the little bottom of the screen where there's a square place for you to leave some words, watch the video, and then when you're done, share it with your gram. Oh, and by the way, I really ruined the audio in this video, so don't leave. If you really don't like the audio, just turn the volume down and watch the pictures. So this model, I honestly had so many issues with this model, and not all models are going to be easy to work on. I would like for anybody who is watching this video to understand that this model was made over around 15 days of actual physical working on this model every single one of those days. This does not include the printing time. To start out making this model, I employed my child. This model started 15 years ago when I had made my child at first, because one day I knew I was going to need my child to help me with the next steps. Whilst I was preparing the rest of the model for painting and painting the little brother of this model, because there are two of them, I used my child's hands to fill in the gaps that were left from trying to print such massive straight pieces in resin. And to fill in these gaps, some of them are really massive. So I needed to fill some packing at first before we used any kind of magical stuff. And the packing I used was just tissue. I packed in the gaps that needed to be filled up, and once they were full, we used some green stuff to fill in the rest of the gap. The reason that I'm going to use green stuff on the top of the base is because there is a lot of texture, kind of like grass, all over the top of this base, and the green stuff is going to form very nicely and shape very easily using a bit of water and a very soft silicone tool. Now for the bottom of the base, this is a little bit different. We need to be able to sand this in case it's not actually perfectly level. And in order to sand green stuff, you need a magical goblin with some kind of very rough bottom. Because I can tell you now, green stuff does not sand nearly as well as what milliput does. And so for filling in those gaps, I used milliput to make sure that I could sand this later. Now as you can see, this is where I came across a problem with the model, and some of the cuts weren't quite right. I needed to cut this rope that goes across his chest because it just didn't fit at all with the model. So I cut those parts off with a rotary tool in my Dremel. Checking the fit of pieces, I can see again that some of the keys just don't quite fit, and the parts of model don't actually fit with each other. So I need to use a sanding tool on my Dremel to grind off some of the bits that are sticking out and try to make this model fit a little bit better. I then use green stuff to go over the rest of the model and fill most of the holes that I had put in for the 3D printing process. When you print large things, you're going to print them most of the time in hollow method of printing, which essentially means that you're going to hollow the models out to save on resin. And this is going to leave some drainage holes, which you'll need to fill up. It was also at this time, which bear in mind is about 3 weeks into 3D printing this model, that I realized that the staff doesn't even fit in his hand, and I'm going to need to get something different for that. Also, if you press your t-shirt into the green stuff before it dries, it will leave a texture that looks like fabric. Fabric texture, gap filling, achievement level unlocked. And this is when I came across another problem with the model. I could not, for the life of me, put this model together because some of the keys were just in the way. Sometimes with complicated cuts, it's just impractical to be able to put the model together like this, and which meant that I'd have to actually end up gluing this model together. I had to cut off some of the keys, and I used epoxy to glue the model together to make sure that it would stay together for the rest of its life. It's at this point that I'm gonna paint all of the detailing that is on the cuffs of the sleeves, and this is because it's just impossible to get to them once they've been glued in. And like I said, this model is impossible to be put together without gluing it together, because I had to cut all of the keys out just to get it to go together. To paint the satchels that are going on the sides of the model, I used a very similar technique to painting miniatures, funny enough. And basically I used a zenithal highlight and I sprayed them with a contrast paint over the top of that to give them the color that I needed, and I used a wash to give them a shadow. And now that I'd given the cuffs enough time to dry, it was time to mask them off before I primed the rest of the model. After priming the model black, I used Wraithbone white to give an entire model a zenithal highlight. You can see that I used this on the base to make the light look like it's slightly in the front of the base. I'm going to use a contrast green over the top so that I can then see that zenithal coming through the transparency of this contrast color. Not all contrast paints are transparent, just bear that in mind. I know that this one is transparent, and you can see me using a darker one in the edges to give a little bit of a shadow to that grass. For the rocks, I just used a bit of black, grey and yellow so that it wasn't just completely grey, and I painted this all over. This is just to make a natural looking change of color all over the rocks. And because this is very thick, it's going to take a while to dry, so I put that aside and I went to working on the model. I used a medium red, which is also a contrast paint, over all the main areas of the model. And then I used a red ink from the top of that, because this was going to create a shadow and a highlight area for me, because I'd already added that zenithal highlight before. So the really bright red going over the top is going to make it look extremely bright on the white points that are left over. I then used a red wash and I sprayed that into all the dark areas and all the crevices of the cloak and all over the robe on the body, and especially from the bottom of the model. I also used my hairdryer to dry this and speed up the process. And it's only once I've got this done that I can actually now take off the masking and I can glue in the hand on the other side of the body. While I was allowing the glue to dry, it was time for me to work on the staff, and I'd printed this in clear resin, so I used black and I painted all over the staff first. It's going to be bronze later, but I wanted to paint black first because I need as many layers over this as possible so that the light doesn't shine through the paint. And instead of cameraman George doing some camera work for me this time, it was cameraman Carrie. And if you like cameraman Carrie, let me know in the comments below, but I'm not gonna lie, she's a little bit erratic with the camera. So I did something that you should never do, and this is, I had already painted these parts before I put the magnets in that I needed to be able to change the heads. So the way that I did this was very carefully drilled out the holes to fit the magnets, and I used a piece of cling film in between the two so that I could get a good bond between the magnets and also not have the parts stick to each other. While that glue was drying, I then needed to paint the skin of this statue. And this model, I needed to actually interpret this guy having gold skin. So the only way that I could think of doing that was to paint his skin gold. I started out with a bronze base color, and this is something that I think would give him the shadows that he needs. I then used a rich gold over the top of that and this is going to give me the highlights that I need. You can see me masking off the red that I had painted because this was the steps that I decided to take to paint this model. There's a lot of tricky bits on this model, and a lot of things needed to be painted in a very specific order in order to not ruin everything. Once the skin was dry, it was time for me to come back and paint that little trimming that goes around the outside of the hood. And the easy part is just painting down the gray that goes on there first. I mixed black and white to make this color, and I kind of mixed it a little bit darker at the bottom and a little bit brighter at the top. When I was done with that trimming around the hood, I then went in to paint the hair on the first sculpt. And there are two sculpts for this, so you'll see me paint the other one later. But to paint the hair, I just used a silver gray and I painted this in layers. I pretty much kept coming back to this over time so that it would build up as I went, because I don't want it to be too stark, and I wanted there to be a load of different textures and colors because it is essentially hair. It can't be just perfect. Also, I had to paint the red back in to the inside of the hood, and that was extremely difficult. Let's not talk about it. I used the bony color to paint the trimming around the stitching that holds this satchel together. I also used that same color to do the stitches on the satchel itself. For the base, there is a load of flowers, which was another issue for me, and to paint these was extremely difficult because they are attached to the base, meaning I had to do some really clever tricks. And it's not that clever, actually. Basically, I just painted them white, and this is because later on I'm going to put a transparent paint over the top, which I can build upon itself, and hopefully it won't ruin the green that's underneath it. It was at this time that I went back to the base and I gave it a dry brush all over the base where I needed to make it look like rock. Essentially, I did this at first and I came back with washes later to give it some saturation so it wasn't just grey, because if it was light grey it wouldn't even look like rock, to be fair. Then it was time to buckle up and just paint these bloody flowers, and the way I did this was giving them an all over, very soft, very careful. I turned my airbrush all the way down and carefully gave them a single coat and allowed them to dry. Once they were dried, I came back with the same low pressured airbrush and sprayed just the centers of each flower. I did this a couple of times and it slowly built up a gradient, and I also sprayed some of the lower flowers so that they were a little bit darker than some of the higher flowers. I then used a muddy orange color to paint the center of each flower. This is going to be the base, and I'm going to add a highlight or a much lighter sort of yellowish kind of orange over the top of that just to give it some depth. And while those flowers dried, I then dry brushed a little bit of a darker green and then a lighter green over the base, and where the light was cast from the staff in his hand, I painted with a bit of yellow. And by painting, I mean I dry brushed with a bit of yellow. And as you can see, this really helps to sell the whole fantasy vibes of this piece. Now for the parts on the body that were really difficult to get to, because in the ideal world you would actually want these satchels and pieces to be separate so you can glue them on or use magnets to attach them later on. This makes it easier for you to paint the model, and in this case it's a very large model. This is the kind of thing that a miniature would have attached to it, and you could paint it on the miniature and not a friggin' quarter scale statue. So I treated this almost in the same way that I would treat a miniature, and I painted everything that I needed to be painted black first, and then I used a dry brushing of white over the top of that to create some volumes on these pieces, and I used contrast paints and I sprayed over the top of those exactly how I would with a miniature, because this is how a miniature would come, not a quarter scale statue. And in reality, trying to really paint things where a paintbrush can't get to, it's just something that can't happen. So I needed to make a plan, and the plan was this. There are some feathers that are dangling, which I definitely cannot get to the back of. It's impossible. I tried my best, but the only thing I could do is paint everything that you could see and make sure that was painted as well as I could. Then there is some ropes that go around the model, and these ropes need to be painted with some kind of texture. They're very flat, they kind of look like Play-Doh worms, and the thing that I decided to do was paint the white texture onto them and paint a wash or essentially another contrast paint over the top of them. I really am using a lot of contrast paint on this model. But once that contrast paint had tinted the color that I needed, I then used my airbrush and I came back and I sprayed from the bottoms of those pieces. I also used the airbrush to kind of outline the edge of these pieces. This creates a separation from the material that is below it and the material that is on top of it. It was at this time that I chose to glue on the satchels and the rope. There was no ways that these pieces could be added on later or attached later in any other way. They had to be glued. It's just the way that this model was made. Now I came back to the staff, and this is when I painted the bronze. Because I had painted the black earlier, this gave me a leg up, meaning I only needed to paint 1 or 2 layers of this bronze to make sure that the light didn't shine through. For the portrait of this face, on the eyes, I painted them black. I really don't know what the inside color of a golden person's eye would look like, and so I opted for black just to give it a shape, and I used a silver gray on the inside, and I painted the insides of the whites of the eye, making sure to leave a highlight in the center of the eye and the edges a little bit darker. I used that same silver gray to paint in the eyebrows on this character, which are non-existent, but I used a couple little textured strokes to make it kind of look like hairs. And on this particular portrait, I hadn't got around to painting the inside yet, so this is when I painted the red on the inside of the hood, and again, I don't want to talk about this. This character has hourglass eyes, and it's got something to do with him being able to see time and how it affects things, or something like that. It's some kind of weird magic Dungeons and Dragons stuff, and I decided that I couldn't do that with the brush, so I drew it on my iPad and I printed it on a water slide decal and I stuck those in place. I then painted the rest of the hood, and again on the outside, not so difficult, but painting on the inside of the hood, almost impossible. I don't even know how you would cut this so that I didn't have to do it this way, but genuinely, this was difficult. Sometimes when it's really difficult like this, you just need to put on a series, a movie, some kind of audio book or something, and just kind of get in the zone and just forget that this is really difficult and just do it. I used a clear gloss varnish over the eyes and over the lips on both of the sculpts. And once I was done with that, it was time to work on some of the electronics on this model. And the customer asked for the rock on the base to be a switch which switches on the light on the model. And in hindsight, that was probably not the best idea. However, I managed to make it work. I'm not really sure how we're going to get the connections working for when he gets it on his side, but either way, I managed to get this to work by cutting out a load of pieces on the base. There was a little base cut compartment thing for the battery. It wasn't even, either way, this didn't work. It was really difficult to do, and I ended up making it work with a lot of magic. It was called magic, and I can't really say much else about that. After I'd soldered in the switch, which by the way I'd never used one of these 6-pin switches and took me half a day just to figure that part out, I'd made sure that there was a connection and that the lights worked, and that is where I took this massive small child-sized model and put it on the table and called it done. Now, as usual, I hope that you've learned something out of this video, even if it helped you the smallest amount. Of course, we are at the point where I need to say a special thank you to the people who support my channel. And you can support my channel in many ways. There are a lot of free ways for you to do that. That is namely by liking the video or sharing it with your gran. We've already discussed this, but there is one step further, and that is if you want to support me financially and keep the lights blinding my eyeballs, you would then possibly want to join my Patreon. Over on the Patreon, you get absolutely nothing other than the knowledge that you are helping your favorite content creator create more content. And speaking of the Patreon, I would like to thank the latest Patreons we got right now: Gregory Kudek, Techie 1986, and Ryan Anderson. Thank you, my dudes, for keeping the lights on and helping my eyeballs to be blinded by the light of the Patreon. Now we're at my best and favorite part of any video that I will ever make, and this is when I get to tell you, if you didn't like what you saw in this video, that's fine. All you need to do is just f*** off. Now that I'm done with work, I can get back to playing with Warhammer toys.